The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. We will start this section of the next video with a quick recap of the year prior. 1994. Nirvana embarks on a European tour in support of In Utero, but cancels halfway through due to poor health conditions. By March, Cobain is in the hospital with an apparent overdose in Rome. Kurt goes to Exodus Recovery Center in LA by April. Cobain is considered missing and suicidal after leaving the rehab facility in LA. Kurt would be located by Tom Grant, who was hired by Cobain's wife to locate him. Courtney is accused of attempting to have her husband killed. She also spreads a ton of rumors about Kurt to the media. Kurt is still heavily considering to file for divorce by the end of April of 1994. Cobain would then go back into rehab for the next few months, knowing he screwed himself and the band over by canceling tour dates and doing heroin. Kurt knowing that he is financially liable for canceling the tour. Courtney Love would overdose on sleeping pills in the summer of 1994, and Kurt would end up leaving rehab again to take care of his daughter. Along with more domestic disputes, Kurt goes back into rehab while Courtney resides in the Lake Washington home. In the midst of all of this, Dave Grohl is working on a solo album, and Kurt has jammed a handful of times with Pat Smear and Michael Stipe of REM. Although at this time, nothing is known to be recorded. Nirvana is under fire in the media, with many calling the band lazy and Kurt a washed-up junkie. Chris nor Dave have spoken to Kurt since late March 1994, with many believing Nirvana is done for good. 1994 would prove to be the worst year for Nirvana fans and for Cobain himself. At this point in late 1994, Kurt has no intentions on getting the band back together. At this point in time, he feels like that part of his life has fizzled out. It's been almost a year since he overdosed in Rome, and he hasn't felt mentally the same since. It's almost been a year since we lost him in April of 1994 in our real timeline. Leading up into 1995, Kurt is alive and in a different place than he was the year prior. He's slowly getting off heroin. He's now using methadone supplied by the rehab facility to wean himself off the harsh drug. This is only baby steps, considering the harsh, difficult reality of getting clean of heroin. It's a long road ahead for Kurt. This is only the beginning. Also, around this time, in the winter of 1994, Kurt begins to reconnect with some old friends from Seattle over the phone. Namely, Mark Lanegan of Screaming Trees, along with Buzz Osborne of Melvins. Kurt neglects to reconnect with anyone from his previous drug scene in Seattle. Mark Lanegan tells Kurt he also wishes to join the rehab facility to get himself clean of heroin. Kurt putting himself through rehab is inspiring to many drug users from Seattle, with general consensus saying, if Kurt can do it, anyone can. And now this brings us to 1995. It is now January of 1995. Dave Grohl is interviewed about his new project. In the interview, he goes on about how he hasn't spoken to Kurt since March of last year. Almost a year. But he hopes Cobain is doing well, knowing he's in rehab right now. When asked about the state of Nirvana, Dave Grohl simply said, I think it's done. It's not up to me. It's Kurt's band. He would later mention his new album coming out, saying, it will give Nirvana fans what they've been wanting for the past year. The album, titled Late Foo Fighters, is scheduled to be released in the spring and has been picked up by DGC. When asked about the album, Nirvana's manager said, it's really beautiful stuff. It's Nirvana without Kurt Cobain, written and played solely by Dave. A lot of Nirvana fans are not sure what to think about this. Chris Novoselic would come forward and say that he is invested in politics now, and is starting a new thing called Jam Pack, which will bring together politically enthusiastic musicians where they can jam and talk politics with other like-minded people. He would also go on to say that he missed Kurt and wishes he would return his phone calls. Courtney Love files a lawsuit against the nanny, claiming that she unlawfully took my child away from me, as the nanny resides in LA, near the facility where Kurt is staying. Courtney begins to spend more time with Billy Corgan. Her and Kurt are still officially married. February of 1995. Kurt, being in rehab for the last month, decided to clear the air and agrees to do a Rolling Stone interview he was asked to do a month prior. The journalist for Rolling Stone arrives at Exodus to speak with Kurt. She would note, he had a huge smile on his face. He looked clean and happy. And he had really long hair. She would go on to say that she thinks rehab had a positive effect on him, and that seeing his daughter daily played a big role in his healing. Kurt would begin by saying his eyes aren't what they used to be, and he thinks he should get some glasses, although it was shrugged off by both Cobain and the journalist. The interview would start with the most pressing question: Nirvana. When asked if Nirvana is still a thing, Kurt said, "I never thought it wouldn't be a thing, but there's a time and a place, and right now, times have been tough." He would go on to say it's Valentine's Day, and instead of being with his wife, she's probably out there doing God knows what. When asked about the divorce rumors, Cobain would say, "It's always the most personal things in my life that get talked about, and it's usually wrong. Don't always believe what you read." He didn't elaborate further on the subject. Kurt would say, from April of 1994 until now has been the hardest time he has ever had in his life. Being in rehab and getting off heroin was not easy, and he is still suffering. When asked about Lollapalooza and Woodstock, he said the whole thing was a giant misunderstanding and that he didn't back out of the headlining spot, stating, "I never agreed to it in the first place, but it was talked about." He was then asked about the backlash from fans and management saying Nirvana is lazy and not worth the time. Kurt shrugged that off as if that's what he was wanting to hear for the last couple years. Kurt would say, "I've been working on some things here and there, but nothing is solid. Music doesn't matter to me like it once did." When asked if he heard about Grohl's new solo project, he replied with a simple, "Yeah," but did not elaborate any further. Kurt would then go on to say he hopes to hear from Chris soon, and that he feels bad about their last encounter back in March, saying, "Chris means well, he always did. I can't be mad at him for that." Kurt and Pat Smear have kept in touch frequently, with Pat being the one to bring Kurt and Michael Stipe together for jam sessions, although it is thought that nothing has been recorded out of this time. Kurt then leaves to make a phone call, and the interview ends. By March of 1995, Kurt's short-term memory is starting to fade away. He believes this is an effect from the overdose he had in Rome of March of last year. It could also be an effect of weaning yourself off heroin and taking methadone. This is the month where Kurt finally leaves the Exodus rehab facility for the final time. This time he's allowed to leave. His time is up, although he is still required to take methadone every morning. He feels now that he got enough of his life together to start to plan for his future. On the last day of rehab before he leaves, Chris calls Kurt. They talk for about 20 minutes. The first place Kurt goes is to see his daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, who's staying with a nanny in a hotel close to the Exodus facility. The lawsuit that Love filed against the nanny gets thrown out of court in late March, as Love neglected to show up in court. In late March of 1995, Pat Smear and Chris Novoselic will get together with Kurt Cobain at Chris Novoselic's house in Seattle. There, Kurt talks about what he needs to do about Courtney and more or less opens up in front of Chris and Pat, which usually doesn't happen. No music is played. It was just three guys hanging out, Smear would recall later in an interview. They talked about Dave and his solo ventures. Kurt didn't seem to think much of it, but Pat and Chris insisted that they both heard it and that people are going to go crazy over it. Kurt kind of laughed it off with a snicker, but it was a general consensus in the room that Kurt seemed just a little jealous. Kurt talked about wanting to divorce Courtney and said he didn't care if he lost everything. He just wants Frances Bean to be with him. Tom Grant goes public yet again about Courtney Love, stating that Kurt should still go through with his divorce proceedings, this being the second time anyone has more or less confirmed that the divorce was legit. April 1995, 1 year after we lose Kurt Cobain in our real timeline. 1 year later, in this timeline, Kurt Cobain is still alive. Kurt has been out of rehab for almost a month. Other than the methadone he must take every morning, he's feeling good. He's still going through a lot mentally and doesn't feel like his mind is fully there. He feels good about himself and the future of his daughter. This makes him eager to reclaim the name and notoriety he had once built. Kurt calls Nirvana's management company and lets them know he's clean and he's off the junk for good. 1 year ago today, we had almost lost Kurt Cobain. Imagine if we did. Imagine if we lost Kurt Cobain in April 1994, and how different the world would be without him. One man, alive or dead, can change that much about pop culture. Without Kurt, he becomes a martyr. He becomes a myth. Like some type of feedback Jesus we all love and adore, and worship. With Kurt gone, he becomes this depressed idol, this super troubled, poor soul who couldn't take it anymore and gave in to the pressures. Music changes. Music becomes centered around what he did and how. It opened the door for more and more alternative and rip-offs trying to be the next Kurt. With Kurt still here, that's different. He's not some false god. He's not a martyr. He's just a man. He's not the depressed idol or tortured soul. He's just like every other rock star on the face of the planet, and the longer he lives, the less mystique surrounds his character. He becomes more like us. He is no longer young forever. The solution now lies in Kurt's hands. If he can balance what he worked through the past year and figure out his relationship problems and inner demons, the entire situation with Nirvana and management can be fixed. He just needed the time and effort put into himself. May 1995. Kurt officially serves Courtney the divorce papers. Kurt grows tired of Courtney hanging around Billy Corgan and would later state they might as well be together. Kurt knows he could potentially lose half of his stuff, including his home, but he doesn't care. He had already taken Courtney out of his will. This means nothing to him at this point. He will fight for the custody of his daughter. In the event of divorce, Courtney will get none of the revenue from future Nirvana sales. Nevermind is still a top-selling album in 1995. Kurt has money, and has already worked out a deal with the record company to make up for lost time and money after a disastrous year for Nirvana in 1994. Kurt now has long hair and a full beard, which he calls his Jesus look. This is the Kurt we haven't seen. He's not on heroin. He seems happy and he's ready to get his career on track, or so he may say. This has been his job for the past 4 years. He does not know how to work a day job. He feels as if he can't do anything else. Kurt Cobain makes music. Courtney goes on record of saying Kurt will never get custody of their daughter and that she can provide a better life for her than he could. June 1995. Kurt begins to look for a new home, this time outside of LA. He doesn't want to be in Seattle anymore. He knows way too many people there and too much about the drug scene. He wants to be as far away from that as possible. Kristen's death still haunts him, and he blames Seattle and Courtney. He sees Kristen's death as a major loss to the music industry and to himself. Kurt has been held up in hotels for the past few months knowing he can't go home to Seattle where Courtney is, nor does he want to. But luckily his daughter and her nanny are with him. July 4th, 1995. Dave Grohl's new solo album, now titled Foo Fighters, is released to massive sales and regarded as the album that will save grunge and bring alternative rock into the late 90s. Grohl is highly praised for his work on the album, being recorded solely by Grohl himself. Talk begins about Grohl taking the album on tour, but as of right now, he doesn't have a band to play with. No official word on Grohl's status with Nirvana. Around this time, Tom Grant starts to become more and more public about the Cobain love affairs, telling outlets about Courtney's supposed plot to have Kurt murdered in March of 1994. A lot of people think the claims are false and that Tom Grant is just out to make money or exposure of some kind from Cobain's personal issues. Tom Grant becomes a major player in the Cobain conversation around this time. His name is seemingly always brought up when talking about Cobain in the beginning to the summer of 1995. After hearing of Tom Grant's claims, a man by the name of Eldon Hoke, aka El Duce, comes forward and alleges that he was offered $50,000 by Courtney Love to murder Kurt Cobain back in 1993. Another man by the name of Alan Wrench would come forward in an impromptu interview backstage at a dive bar show with his band and state that him and El Duce were the ones who were supposed to do the job, but both men got too drunk and forgot. Cobain got away and escaped to the safeties of rehab. Nobody believes the Alan Wrench and El Duce claims. In this timeline, El Duce doesn't do a polygraph test. There's no point if Kurt is alive. They are just bogus claims by a couple guys looking to get some attention. Tom Grant is still adamant that Michael Cally DeWitt was the man who was sent to the greenhouse on that misty April morning to assist in the death of Kurt Cobain, presumably hired by Courtney. In the Seattle drug world, with Kurt gone, and in LA, the word of the possible murder plot the year prior starts to circulate. And people like Dylan Carlson come forward and speak on the situation. Dylan was Kurt's best friend, but after Kurt left Seattle and went to rehab in LA, they haven't spoken. Kurt purposely didn't contact Dylan when he went back to Seattle, when he was still back and forth from rehab, because of the heroin. Kurt wanted nothing to do with heroin anymore. It was killing him, and he knew it. He didn't want to die. He wanted to raise his daughter, if anything. That's all he wants to do. Dylan wasn't mad at Kurt for not contacting him. He understood Kurt and knew it was for the best. There was always the animosity. Dylan thought his band, Earth, should have had the spot Nirvana had. But there was never any hate. Dylan claims to have loved Kurt. He speaks on the murder plot and said, Courtney is too stupid, incompetent to pull that one off. There's no way. But maybe she did plan it and it didn't work out. Kurt isn't dead as far as I know. So maybe she really is incompetent. When asked if he thought Kurt was suicidal, he scoffed. Dylan would go on to say, "I would have taken his guns away from him if I thought he was suicidal." August 1995. Kurt appears on the cover of Spin magazine, looking like we've never seen him before. Full beard and long hair, looking healthier than he ever has. In this issue of Spin, Cobain tells all about the last year and a half of his life. The band, Courtney, and the music industry as a whole. He even opens up about Foo Fighters, publicly, for the first time, as well as his project with Michael Stipe. Cobain begins by saying that the rumors about him from the last year are all false. He was never missing. He didn't escape rehab. He, quote unquote, stayed put like the obedient dog that I am. He called the accusations of Courtney trying to have him killed bogus and complete bullshit, stating, "There's always a guy looking to make money off my personal affairs." He would go on to say, "Courtney is just Courtney. She only said those things about me because she thought I was dead. If I was alive, she never would have said that." Cobain was more or less defending his soon-to-be ex-wife. When asked about the divorce rumors, he admitted for the first time that the rumors were true, saying, "The love just isn't there anymore. I had a lot of time to think about it." Cobain spent the better part of the year on and off in the Exodus rehabilitation facility, where he underwent treatment to get him off heroin. It was not easy, and still is not easy. Cobain reportedly escaped the facility twice in 1994. He would return weeks after both times. It's at this point in the interview where he admits that he did escape the rehab facility in April of 1994. And when he did escape, he was actually planning on killing himself. He had recently bought a shotgun and planned to just, quote unquote, end it all that day in April. Kurt would begin talking about Nirvana. The question on everyone's mind is Nirvana dead? Kurt would explain, "I don't think it'll ever be dead. It's just changing. There was a huge part of my life last year where I just couldn't keep doing it. I didn't want to play those songs. I didn't want to tour. It took me a year to think about everything and make some really tough decisions." Kurt was then asked about Dave Grohl's solo project Foo Fighters that was released last month in July. "Quote unquote, I've listened to it. It's exactly what people want Nirvana to be, but not what I want Nirvana to be." He would go on to praise Grohl for his songwriting and playing skills. When asked if Kurt would consider Dave playing drums in Nirvana from this point on, he kind of shrugged it off with, "Of course." But it's no secret to anyone that there was animosity between Kurt and Dave, leading all the way back to 1992. From 1993 and 1994, Kurt would have constantly say he wanted to have Dave replaced on drums. But with Kurt being off heroin, it seems as if he cherishes the friendships he had and may have destroyed while he was on drugs over anything else musically. He did, however, make it very clear that Nirvana was his band, not Dave's and not Chris's. Those guys can go off and do whatever they want to do musically, and it won't affect Kurt's creative direction. He joked that the next Nirvana album will consist solely of Leadbelly covers, in which he will record entirely by himself. It's unsure if that was a subtle jab at Dave's recent musical ventures. Kurt would explain that he talks to Chris and Pat frequently now, but hasn't talked to Dave. Quote unquote, "It's not even about the music. We just talk. Shoot the shit." When asked if he thinks Dave is upset with him and why they haven't talked, Kurt added, "Probably." Kurt would talk about writing new material with Michael Stipe, saying, "It was fun. It's weird stuff. Nothing really solid right now, but it was fun stuff. I can see some of it being on the next Nirvana record, or maybe even REM." Cobain would then also state that there is still unused Nirvana material and some things recorded back in 1994, quote unquote, "when I was on drugs," Cobain simply put. He would then go on to talk about the state of the music industry. He liked bands like Green Day. He liked Beck a lot, and was heartbroken when Shannon Hoon of Blind Melon passed away from a heroin overdose. Cobain had often seen death at the hands of heroin. One of the reasons he decided to stick with rehab. He didn't want to die. Kurt wouldn't slam fans. He praised them for caring enough to stick by him through the hardest times of his life. He did, however, slam MTV and media outlets for spewing garbage about his personal affairs and falsely reporting him as dead twice. Cobain bashed Hole's 1994 Live Through This album, saying, "If it wasn't for me, that album wouldn't exist. I had nothing to do with the writing. It's just a bonehead in utero." He would then go on to say that the only talented person in Hole was Kristen Paff, who tragically passed away in 1994. Kurt would discuss Silverchair and their debut album Frog Stomp, which had just come out. He would say, "It's like Nirvana and Pearl Jam had a baby and sold out. Total joke stuff." Cobain would explain the sound of a generation being manipulated and copied. "They got it wrong. It's not the music we make, but how we make it. Everyone sounds like us now, so I just want us to change how we sound." When asked if that means there will be another Nirvana album, Kurt responded with, "Absolutely." Whether that means with Dave Grohl or not, Cobain made it known that we can expect another Nirvana album someday. Kurt expressed his intentions on working with people like Michael Stipe and Mark Lanegan, maybe even Dan Peters on drums. It is also unsure if that was another jab at Dave Grohl. Who knows what the future holds for Kurt's music endeavors? We all know that right now he is more concerned about his own health and his daughter's livelihood. Music is taking the backseat to everything else at this point in his life, but it is great to see him alive. By September 1995, Tom Grant begins writing his book on his experiences with Cobain and Courtney Love. Although Kurt is alive, Tom is adamant that Courtney and Callie conspired to kill Kurt Cobain. The sudden disappearance of Callie makes it even more suspicious to Tom. He would say, "If I wasn't there, Kurt Cobain would be dead right now, and I feel like it is my duty to make sure that this does not happen to anyone else." We would later find out that Callie is in LA. Pat Smear would join Foo Fighters as backup guitar, as Dave wants to begin jamming the songs live. Dave would also enlist William Goldsmith on drums and Nate Mendel on bass. It seems as if the Foo Fighters is now becoming a full band. September 7th, 1995. Days after his Spin magazine interview, Kurt makes his first public appearance at the 1995 MTV Video Awards. Still sporting his long hair and beard, now he's wearing a dress and glasses. Courtney would also be at the same event, but Cobain was spotted nowhere near Love, who was with Corgan at the time. Kurt didn't make himself known to most of the people there, He did come to the carpet, and when reporters spotted him, he began yelling out, "Has anyone seen my band?" Having only one music video from 1993's In Utero, Nirvana was not included in this year's MTV Video Awards. Other music videos for singles from In Utero were planned, including Pennyroyal Tea and All Apologies. However, these were scrapped due to the events of 1994. In 1994, Nirvana won Best Video for Heart-Shaped Box. Dave and Chris accepted the award without Kurt, who was dealing with personal problems at the time. Cobain would leave the award ceremony early without even really seeing any of the acts, none of which he was interested in. He just wanted to make himself known. It is still unknown to Kurt that Pat Smear has joined Foo Fighters. There's still no word on if he's an official member of the band. October 1995. Things around Kurt are changing. Dave has a new band involving Pat Smear. It's a big deal. People love the songs, and Dave is being said to have picked up the ball and ran with it, in the case of Nirvana's absence. Pat Smear would later say, "I joined Dave's band in hopes to get Kurt and Dave talking again. They're both brilliant songwriters. If they both wrote songs in the same band, that would be better than the Beatles." Courtney and Billy are seeing each other. Kurt is getting divorced. Kurt begins to become depressed of the thought of losing his wife. He blames himself, but those close to him assure Kurt that it's Courtney's doing, and that Kurt will thrive without her, away from Seattle and away from the drugs. Kurt moves into a new home just outside of LA. The nanny moves in to take care of Francis while Kurt deals with his projects. Dave Grohl calls Kurt Cobain on the phone. They have a long conversation lasting over an hour. Pat Smear would later call Kurt Cobain that same night. The contents of these conversations are unknown. November 1995. Dave Grohl does an interview about his new band, Foo Fighters. He says, "I just love writing songs and playing them. It's not a jab at anybody or trying to take the spotlight. I just really like playing." In the same interview, Dave claimed that him and Kurt spoke for hours and that Nirvana is a band and Dave will return to the drum kit when the time comes. He would go on to say that Kurt and Pat are busy working out some new material before Dave will get involved. But he did assure readers that everyone in the band is doing well and on great terms. He mentioned touring with his band Foo Fighters and says that they were well equipped and ready to rip across the country at any notice. When asked if he thinks that will affect Nirvana, he said, "Absolutely not." When asked about his decision to start a new band, he stated, "It wasn't about starting a new band. I just got tired of waiting. I wanted to write and record these songs. I watched my good friend die twice, and he's still here to tell the story. So I'm happy to be a part of both." Foo Fighters really speaks a lot about me and what I went through during that time. Nirvana will always be a part of me too. When asked about dropping the name Late, he said, "That's for the past. I didn't want to be tied to that. This is much more than that." December 1995. Nirvana gets together for the first time with all four members at Cobain's new home outside of LA. For the first time in nearly 2 years, they rehearsed old songs that they used to play. "It was like riding a bike," Novoselic would say. Although it was clear that Cobain was more in tune with his softer side these days, he really enjoyed the stuff he did with Michael Stipe, so Kurt and Pat pull out some new material to show Dave and Chris. Around this time, a leaked Nirvana song started making airwaves across the country, This turned out to be You Know You're Right, recorded at Robert Lang Studios in February 1994, almost 2 years before this. It gained massive airplay and became a hot song on the radio, with fans calling in and asking for the song to be played. Fans did not know the song was actually recorded 2 years ago, before Cobain canceled the In Utero tour and before his overdose in Rome. Nirvana's management would issue cease and desist orders to radio stations who played the song. Realizing the success of the track just in time for the holidays of 1995, Geffen Records would issue a 12-track compilation album of Nirvana songs, with You Know You're Right being the first track. The greatest hits album, titled Nirvana, would be released a week before Christmas in 1995. Cobain was initially displeased with the track's release, stating that it was just a throwaway demo from when I was on drugs. He went on to say that he could do it better now. Cobain agreed to let the song be released on a compilation once he realized the financial benefit it would bring the band in the tough times they were in. It would hold fans over until they could release new. Courtney Love would slam the song, saying it was horrible and annoying. Cobain would never respond to the comment. Leading into 1996, the release of Nirvana proved to be a massive success, selling over 300,000 copies in its first week and debuting at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. This showed Kurt that people were still interested in Nirvana, as Nirvana songs were so original and resonated with fans more so than the other leading bands in the spotlight at the time. Kurt would later say he hated the idea of a compilation album, but he convinced himself it could be used as a way to say goodbye to the old Nirvana and moving into a new style, almost like a rebirth, with the single from the album being 1994 demo You Know You're Right. Management asked Cobain if they would make a video for the song, in which Cobain declined, stating, "We don't play like that anymore." Cobain would allow them to use old live footage of the band to put over the song so it can be played on MTV. "I wanted it to be a farewell to Nirvana, in a way," Cobain would say. While making the video, Geffen had the idea of releasing a live compilation album to accompany the greatest hits, using old live recordings from previous tours dated 1989 to 1994. Cobain once again gave the go-ahead. Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl would compile the tracks for a 1996 release down the road. Financially, the band is looking better than it did mid-1994, partly due to the success of MTV Unplugged and the greatest hits compilation, Nirvana. Now being on methadone, Kurt Cobain is off heroin. It has been quite some time since he last took heroin. 1995 is looking to be a better year on the upswing for Kurt Cobain. It was hard to overcome all of the hurdles he had to overcome from 1994, but here we are at the end of 1995, leading into 1996, and Kurt Cobain is still alive. It is still very unclear how Nirvana as a full band will function after all this time away from each other. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1995. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1996. Please comment down below what you think would happen if Kurt Cobain was still alive.